Hey, good morning. So today is the second part of the Nixon presidency. Um, we talked about Nixon's domestic policies. Today we're going to be focusing on his foreign policies, and then also we'll talk about the Watergate crisis. Um, so Nixon believed that the president's most important role was directing the country's foreign policy. Right. And just to review foreign policy, um, it's one country's policy towards another. So in this occasion, for the Nixon presidency, we're talking about President Nixon's policies towards the rest of the world, which in effect are American policies. Um, now, you have already learned that the Vietnam War was going on. Nixon was in the middle of this withdrawal. Um, he reduced the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, but he did increase bombing raids, financial aid to South Vietnam. He was assisted by a guy named Henry Kissinger when it came to foreign policy. Henry Kissinger is Nixon's foreign policy expert. Um, And both of them had two foreign policy successes here. I would say that the very first one would be he opened diplomatic relations with communist China. Um, and also, another big success here is he began de escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. So, when it comes to foreign policy, Nixon was very interested in opening diplomatic relations with China. Ever since the Communist Revolution in China, so back to 1949, U.S. leaders are not going to establish diplomatic relations with a communist country. The United States treated the nationalist Chinese government, which established itself on the island of Taiwan, the U.S. government considered that to be the official government of China. Um, and they would veto attempts by the communist Chinese government, the real Chinese government, to enter the United Nations. So China wasn't allowed into the UN. Nixon, however, wanted to create a more flexible situation in Asia. And this was in order to put more pressure on North Vietnam. So let's go back here. Not done yet. Although the strong anti-communist that Nixon was, he surprised the world by restoring diplomatic relations with China, communist China. So the United States is effectively saying that under Nixon that this communist Chinese government is the official government of China. In 1972, Nixon became the first American president to visit mainland China. He reopened negotiations with Mao, China, and this is probably going to be Nixon's biggest, most greatest foreign policy feat, accomplishment. Now, President Nixon also believed in pursuing a policy of detente, which basically just means the relaxing of tensions with the Soviet Union, which have been super high, right? Super high tensions. So Nixon introduced this policy to relax these tensions, and him and Kissinger especially wanted to halt this buildup of nuclear weapons. 1972, Nixon becomes the first president to visit Moscow. And he signs this agreement. This agreement is called the SALT Agreement. And it limits the development of defense missile systems. So Nixon further agreed that he's going to sell American grain to the Soviet Union to help them cope with food shortages. In 73, war breaks out in the Middle East, and the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated with pressuring Israel and the Arab states to ceasefire. So this tension with the Soviet Union is starting to relax between helping to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict going on in the Middle East, and also limiting, under this SALT agreement, the number of nuclear weapons that these countries can have, and slowly getting on a path to eliminating these in mass numbers. So those are some foreign policy accomplishments under Nixon. But Vice President Gerald Ford is going to take office. Now, this is strange. And it's strange because Nixon already has a vice president. His name is Spiro Agnew. But he's forced to resign. And let's talk about how that happens real quick. In his election campaign, Nixon promised Americans a return to law and order. But Americans soon learned that his own government was corrupt. 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, we'll say it's this guy right here, he resigned when it was discovered that he had taken bribes while serving as governor of Maryland. So under the 25th Amendment, Nixon appointed this guy, Gerald Ford, who is a Michigan congressman, as his new vice president. So that's how Ford becomes the vice president. Ford's going to take it a step further pretty soon. When we get to this Watergate crisis. Meanwhile, in 1972, a group of former CIA agents, they were working for Nixon's re-election campaign. And they're caught breaking into Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate complex. This is in Washington, D.C. And this would soon become a greater scandal than Spiro Agnew's scandal that caused him to resign the vice presidency, which opened the door for Gerald Ford to become the vice president. This Watergate crisis that Nixon is going to have is a much bigger deal. There's a cover-up. So we'll break this into three parts here to understand Watergate. There's a cover-up. There's some Watergate tapes, recordings, and Nixon resigns. So the cover-up. President Nixon tries to cover up an investigation into this Watergate break-in. And he tries to cover it up on the grounds that it involved national security. Two investigative reporters were the first to break the report that there was a break-in and that maybe the White House was involved in this. The Senate appointed a committee to investigate. The Attorney General also appointed a special prosecutor to examine possible wrongdoing. And Nixon's obviously trying to cover this up and say that they can't investigate him. It's a national security issue. Now, let's talk about the second part, the Watergate tapes. In these Senate hearings, a presidential aide stated that Nixon participated in this cover-up. Next, it's revealed that Nixon secretly recorded all of these White House conversations he was having. When the Senate committee asked to listen to the tapes, Nixon said no. Basically, he refuses, and he claims executive privilege, which Nixon says that Congress has no authority to question members of the executive branch. about, I guess, internal communications. Now, in the case, when it goes to court here, the United States v. Nixon, this is 1974 when this case happens. Nixon further contended that if he obeyed the district's court order that he turn in the tape recordings, it would lead to judicial control of the presidency, right? This violates the separation of powers that we have between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. But the case, when it's appealed to the Supreme Court, ruled that Nixon must turn over the tapes. And it reaffirms this principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. So there's a cover-up. There's tapes. Nixon has to turn over these recordings. Which brings us to the third part of the Watergate crisis scandal. When these tapes were made public, they revealed that Nixon had in fact lied when he said he was not involved in the cover-up. Based on this and a few other allegations, the House of Representatives moved to impeach Nixon. Nixon, fearing removal from office by the Senate, becomes the first president to resign. So Nixon resigns. Now, the Watergate crisis had an impact here on Americans. I would say that it lowered the public's confidence in the government and government officials. I would say that it also showed that the growth of presidential power created opportunities for abuse that are new. It showed that our government is based on laws, not individuals. And that is the system of checks and balances that makes this work. Another impact is it proved the two-party system works. The party out of power serves as a watchdog over the other. It reaffirmed the role of the press in uncovering things like this. Government misconduct, misinforming the public. The Supreme Court preserved its independence, ordering Nixon to hand over the tapes, right? Nixon had said that the judicial is going to take over the executive branch if this happens. No, the Supreme Court preserved its independence, I believe, here. I also think another impact here is that Congress passed new laws to curb presidential power. I think that they restored a balance between the executive and legislative branches here. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. Have a good day and enjoy the storms.